Napoleon Bonaparte. In the autumn of 1799, France stood at a crossroads between revolutionary chaos and authoritarian order. The Directory, that unstable five-man executive that had governed since 1795, had proven itself incapable of managing either military threats abroad or political turmoil at home. Into this vacuum stepped Napoleon Bonaparte, a 30-year-old general whose military genius had already made him a household name across Europe. On the 18th day of Brumaire in the revolutionary calendar, November 9th, 1799, Napoleon orchestrated a coup d'état that would transform him from general to first consul, effectively making him the dictator of France. The facade of republican government remained, but power resided firmly in his hands. Within 5 years, on December 2nd, 1804, he would crown himself Emperor of the French in Notre Dame Cathedral, snatching the crown from Pope Pius VII's hands to place it upon his own head in a gesture that spoke volumes about his relationship with tradition and authority. What followed was a cascade of wars that would engulf Europe for over a decade, redrawing borders, toppling ancient dynasties, and spreading revolutionary ideals at the point of a bayonet. These were not merely conflicts between nations, but collisions between worldviews, between the old order of hereditary monarchy and aristocratic privilege against the new forces of meritocracy, nationalism, and centralized state power that Napoleon embodied. The Treaty of Amiens had brought a fleeting peace to Europe in 1802, but it was a peace built on misunderstandings and mutual suspicion, rather than genuine reconciliation. Britain, the maritime power that had fought revolutionary France for nearly a decade, watched with growing alarm as Napoleon consolidated his power and extended French influence far beyond what the treaty had envisioned. When Napoleon annexed Piedmont, occupied Swiss territory, and intervened in German affairs, Britain refused to evacuate Malta, as the treaty required. By May 1803, the fragile peace shattered, and Britain declared war once more. Yet Britain alone, despite its naval supremacy, could not challenge Napoleon's continental dominance. The island nation needed allies, and it found them in the old absolutist monarchies of Austria and Russia, both alarmed by Napoleon's appetite for expansion and his embodiment of revolutionary principles. By August 1805, Britain had succeeded in knitting together the Third Coalition, promising subsidies and diplomatic support to Vienna and St. Petersburg in exchange for their armies marching against France. Napoleon's initial response to the renewed British hostility had been characteristically audacious. He assembled the Grande Armée along the Channel coast, drilling over 150,000 men in preparation for an invasion of Britain itself. At Boulogne, soldiers practiced embarkation drills, while engineers designed specialized landing craft. Had Napoleon achieved naval superiority in the Channel, even briefly, the history of Britain might have been rewritten. But naval supremacy eluded him. Admiral Nelson and the Royal Navy maintained their iron grip on the seas, and when the combined French and Spanish fleets attempted to break that grip at Trafalgar on October 21, 1805, they met catastrophic defeat. Nelson died in his moment of triumph, but his victory ensured that Britain would remain inviolable behind its wooden walls. The news of Trafalgar reached Napoleon, as he was already executing a military masterpiece on land. Learning that Austrian and Russian armies were mobilizing against him, he had abandoned the invasion plans and marched the Grande Armée eastward with breathtaking speed. The Austrians under General Mack found themselves outmaneuvered before they fully comprehended what was happening. Napoleon's forces swept through southern Germany in a campaign that lasted barely 3 weeks, surrounding Mack's army at Ulm and forcing the surrender of 30,000 Austrian troops without a major battle. Vienna fell to French forces in November 1805, and the Austrian Emperor Francis fled northward to link up with his Russian allies under Tsar Alexander I. The two emperors established their forces near the Moravian town of Austerlitz, where they believed their combined armies held the advantage. Napoleon, studying the terrain with the eye of a master tactician, recognized opportunity in his enemy's confidence. On December 2nd, 1805, the first anniversary of his coronation, Napoleon fought what would be considered his greatest tactical masterpiece. He deliberately weakened his right flank, positioned on the Pratzen Heights, tempting the Allied armies to attack there. As the Allies moved to exploit what they believed to be a weakness, Napoleon sprang his trap. French forces that had been concealed in early morning fog seized the Pratzen Heights, splitting the Allied army and then crushing each segment in turn. The Battle of Austerlitz shattered the Third Coalition in a single day. Russia retreated eastward with the tattered remnants of its army. Austria sued for peace within weeks, ceding Venetia to Napoleon's Kingdom of Italy and relinquishing its influence in Germany. Through the Treaty of Pressburg, Napoleon effectively ended Austria's role as a major power in German affairs, clearing the way for French hegemony over Central Europe. The Holy Roman Empire, that thousand-year-old political structure that had nominally unified the German-speaking lands since the time of Charlemagne, would dissolve within a year, replaced by Napoleon's Confederation of the Rhine, a collection of German states bound to France through alliance and intimidation. Prussia had remained neutral during the Third Coalition, watching from the sidelines as Napoleon dismembered the old order in Germany. But neutrality brought no rewards, and Prussian King Frederick William III found himself marginalized in the new European order, despite his kingdom's formidable military reputation. The traditions of Frederick the Great still echoed through Prussian army camps, but those glorious traditions were now nearly half a century old, and the army that had made Prussia a great power had calcified into rigid adherence to outdated tactics. When Napoleon created the Confederation of the Rhine in July 1806, effectively placing Western and Southern German states under French protection, Prussian pride finally snapped. The creation of this confederation was not merely a diplomatic slight, but an existential threat. It isolated Prussia diplomatically and demonstrated French hegemony over German affairs. Queen Louise, young and passionate, became the voice of the war party at the Prussian court, pressing her hesitant husband to act before Prussia became completely irrelevant. In September 1806, Prussia issued an ultimatum demanding that French forces withdraw from German territories. Napoleon treated the ultimatum with contempt. Russia, Prussia's primary ally in this new coalition, had not yet recovered from Austerlitz, and its armies were too distant to provide immediate support. The Prussian army mobilized with all the pageantry and confidence of a military machine that believed itself invincible. Officers led troops armed with tactics perfected in the 1750s, arranged in the same linear formations that Frederick the Great had used to win his victories. They would learn, with shocking swiftness, that the world had changed. Napoleon moved with characteristic speed, advancing into Saxony with multiple corps operating independently, but capable of supporting each other. The flexible corps system that allowed the Grande Armée to concentrate force at decisive points while maintaining dispersed logistics. On October 14, 1806, two separate but coordinated battles destroyed Prussian military power in a single day. At Jena, Napoleon personally commanded forces that shattered a Prussian army he believed was the main enemy force. 20 miles north at Auerstedt, Marshal Davout's Third Corps, though outnumbered 2-1, routed what was actually the main Prussian army under the Duke of Brunswick, who fell mortally wounded during the fighting. The twin battles of Jena-Auerstedt revealed the yawning gap between Napoleonic warfare and the military systems of the old regime. Prussian linear tactics, designed for set-piece battles on open terrain, collapsed against the fluid movement and combined arms coordination of the French corps system. The aftermath proved even more devastating than the battles themselves. The Prussian army disintegrated not through further combat, but through sheer demoralization. Fortresses that should have required months to reduce surrendered after token resistance. Berlin fell without a fight. Napoleon entered Frederick the Great's capital as a conqueror and stood before the tomb of the king he had once admired, reportedly saying to his marshals, "If he were still alive, we would not be here." Within a month, Prussia ceased to exist as an independent military power. But Russia had not abandoned its Prussian ally, and as winter descended, Russian armies moved westward into Poland and East Prussia. What followed was a brutal winter campaign, fought in conditions that would foreshadow the horrors of 1812. At Eylau in February 1807, Napoleon faced his most difficult battle to date. In a snowstorm that reduced visibility to mere yards, French and Russian forces collided in savage fighting that left tens of thousands dead or wounded for no clear strategic gain. Napoleon would later admit that Eylau had been a massacre rather than a victory, though French propagandists presented it as a triumph. The decisive engagement came 4 months later at Friedland on June 14, 1807. Russian forces under General Bennigsen made the tactical error of crossing the Alle River and concentrating their army with the river at their backs. Napoleon, recognizing the opportunity, massed his artillery and launched a devastating attack that drove the Russians into the river, drowning thousands. The Battle of Friedland broke Russian morale and convinced Tsar Alexander I that further fighting was futile. On June 25, 1807, Napoleon and Alexander met on a raft anchored in the middle of the Niemen River at Tilsit. The symbolism was carefully constructed, two emperors meeting as equals, with Prussia's humiliated Frederick William relegated to the shore, literally and figuratively, on the periphery. The Treaty of Tilsit redrew the map of Europe. Prussia was stripped of half its territory, losing all lands west of the Elbe River, and its Polish territories, which Napoleon organized into the Grand Duchy of Warsaw, a French satellite state. Prussia was reduced from a great power to a second-rate German state, its army limited to 42,000 men, and forced to pay massive war indemnities. Russia, having lost the battle but not the war, received gentler treatment. Alexander agreed to join Napoleon's continental system, the economic blockade against Britain, and received a free hand to expand against Ottoman Turkey and Sweden. For a moment, it appeared that Napoleon had achieved what he had sought since Austerlitz, a European order organized around French hegemony, with Russia as a junior partner and Britain isolated across the Channel. Napoleon's continental system, designed to strangle British commerce by closing European ports to British goods, required universal compliance to be effective. Portugal, Britain's oldest ally, refused to comply. This small kingdom on Europe's western edge presented a gap in Napoleon's economic wall, and he could not tolerate gaps. But Portuguese territory could not be easily accessed by French armies without crossing Spain, and Spain was nominally France's ally under the ineffectual King Charles IV and his corrupt favorite, Manuel Godoy. Napoleon saw opportunity in Spanish weakness. In 1807, he negotiated the Treaty of Fontainebleau with Spain, ostensibly to allow French troops passage to Portugal. By November 1807, French forces under General Junot had occupied Lisbon, though the Portuguese royal family escaped to Brazil aboard British ships. But French troops did not withdraw from Spain after completing their mission. Instead, Napoleon reinforced them and gradually occupied key Spanish fortresses and cities. In March 1808, French forces effectively occupied Spain, and Napoleon engineered the abdications of Bayonne, forcing both Charles IV and his son Ferdinand to renounce their claims to the Spanish throne. Napoleon then placed his brother Joseph on the Spanish throne, an act of dynasty building that fundamentally misread Spanish society and culture. Spain erupted. What began as scattered protests in May 1808 transformed into a national uprising that defied all of Napoleon's calculations. The Spanish people, deeply Catholic and fiercely independent, rejected a foreign king imposed by force. On May 2, 1808, Madrid rose in spontaneous revolt against French occupation forces. The uprising was brutally suppressed. Francisco Goya would immortalize the massacre in his painting, The 3rd of May, 1808. But the violence in Madrid sparked revolts across the entire peninsula. Provincial juntas declared themselves the legitimate government of Spain in Ferdinand's name and called for resistance. This was something new in European warfare. The Spanish resistance did not primarily take the form of conventional armies meeting in set-piece battles, though such engagements occurred. Instead, Spain gave the world a new word, guerrilla or little war. Spanish irregulars operating from mountainous terrain with intimate knowledge of local geography ambushed French columns, cut supply lines, and assassinated collaborators. They received weapons and supplies from the British, who landed an expeditionary force in Portugal under Sir Arthur Wellesley, the future Duke of Wellington, in August 1808. Napoleon himself entered Spain in November 1808 with over 200,000 reinforcements, determined to crush the rebellion through overwhelming force. He drove British forces back to Corunna and temporarily restored French control over major cities. But when urgent business called him back to Paris, Austria was showing signs of renewed hostility. He left the pacification to his marshals, and they proved unequal to the task. The Peninsular War became a running sore that drained French military resources year after year. Conventional French tactics designed for European battlefields failed against an enemy that refused to fight conventional battles. French forces could control whatever ground their armies physically occupied, but the moment they moved on, guerrillas reoccupied the territory. Atrocities bred atrocities. French troops, frustrated by an invisible enemy who might be any Spanish peasant, responded with savage reprisals against civilian populations. Spanish guerrillas retaliated by torturing captured French soldiers. The war descended into a cycle of violence that degraded both sides and made negotiated peace impossible. Meanwhile, Wellington methodically expanded British control in Portugal, creating a secure base behind the lines of Torres Vedras, a massive defensive system that made Lisbon impregnable. Through 1809, 1810, and 1811, the pattern repeated itself. French armies would concentrate their forces and win conventional victories against Spanish regular armies or push Wellington back into Portugal. But then, as soon as the French dispersed to garrison the conquered territories, guerrillas would resurface and the whole exhausting process would begin again. Marshal Massena's invasion of Portugal in 1810 demonstrated the futility of French efforts. He advanced with 65,000 men, defeated Wellington at Busaco, and pursued the British towards Lisbon. But when Massena encountered the lines of Torres Vedras, he found an impregnable position. Wellington's army sat behind fortifications stretching across the entire peninsula, supplied by the Royal Navy, while the Portuguese countryside had been stripped of food. Massena could neither assault the lines nor maintain his army in devastated territory. After months of fruitless waiting, he withdrew, his army reduced by hunger and harassment to barely 40,000 effective troops. By 1812, Wellington had gone on the offensive, systematically liberating Spanish cities. Ciudad Rodrigo fell in January 1812, Badajoz in April after a brutal siege. That summer, Wellington won a crushing victory at Salamanca, demonstrating that British infantry properly deployed could defeat even veteran French forces. Joseph Bonaparte fled Madrid, and the French grip on Spain began to slip irreversibly. The Peninsular War demonstrated the limits of Napoleonic power. France had conquered kingdoms and humbled emperors, but it could not pacify a people who refused to accept conquest. The war tied down between 200,000 and 300,000 French troops who were desperately needed elsewhere, and it provided Britain with a continental foothold from which to project power. Wellington called it the Spanish ulcer, and indeed, the infection spread through Napoleon's empire, weakening it at the moment when new challenges emerged from the east. Austria had not forgotten Austerlitz or Pressburg. In Vienna, a reform party led by Archduke Charles recognized that Austria could not face France with the same armies and tactics that had failed in 1805. Charles reorganized the Austrian army, introducing corps-level organization similar to the French system, improving artillery, and creating a reserve system that increased available manpower. By early 1809, with Napoleon deeply committed in Spain and the continental system breeding widespread resentment, Vienna judged the moment opportune for revenge. War came in April 1809 when Austrian armies invaded Bavaria, a French ally and member of the Confederation of the Rhine. The declaration of war surprised Napoleon strategically, but not tactically. His intelligence network had detected Austrian preparations, and though he was still in Paris when war began, he rushed to Bavaria and assumed command of French and German forces within days. The opening moves went badly for Austria, despite their reforms. Napoleon defeated Archduke Charles at Abensberg, Landshut, and Eckemühl in rapid succession, battles that demonstrated that Austrian reforms had improved their army, but not made it the equal of Napoleon's veterans. Vienna fell to French forces in May for the second time in 4 years. But Charles had preserved his main army, and it took up positions north of the Danube River near the village of Aspern-Essling. Napoleon, seeking to bring Charles to decisive battle before Austrian forces in Italy could reinforce him, attempted to cross the Danube in May 1809. The crossing went wrong. Austrian artillery and a lucky flood that broke the bridges stranded much of the French army on the north bank, without adequate supplies or support. In the 2-day Battle of Aspern-Essling, Archduke Charles inflicted on Napoleon his first unambiguous defeat. French forces fought desperately to hold their bridgehead, but were eventually forced back across the Danube, having suffered over 20,000 casualties, including Marshal Lannes, one of Napoleon's closest friends and ablest commanders, who died of wounds sustained in the battle. The defeat shocked Europe. Napoleon was not invincible. For 6 weeks, the two armies faced each other across the Danube, while Napoleon carefully prepared his next move. He built a fortified island base on Lobau in the middle of the Danube, stockpiled supplies, and assembled his full strength. In early July, he launched his crossing in overwhelming force at a different point than the Austrians expected. The Battle of Wagram, fought July 5th to 6th, 1809, was one of the largest battles in history to that date, involving over 300,000 combatants. It was also one of the bloodiest and most indecisive of Napoleon's victories. The fighting at Wagram lacked the elegant tactical maneuvers of Austerlitz or Jena. Instead, it was a brutal slugging match where superior French artillery gradually wore down Austrian resistance. After 2 days of savage fighting that cost over 70,000 casualties on both sides, Archduke Charles withdrew his battered army, recognizing that he could not win a war of attrition. Austria sued for peace within weeks. The Treaty of Schönbrunn in October 1809 cost Austria dearly. It lost 3.5 million subjects and large territories to Bavaria, Russia, and the Grand Duchy of Warsaw. It was excluded from the Adriatic coast, and French control over Central Europe became complete. Yet the War of the Fifth Coalition revealed troubling signs for Napoleon's empire. Victory had been costly and difficult. The satellite kingdoms had not provided forces with the enthusiasm Napoleon expected. German territories chafed under French demands for troops and taxes, and most significantly, Spain continued to bleed French resources. Napoleon stood at the apex of his power in late 1809, but the foundations of that power were not as secure as they appeared. The continental system was failing to destroy British commerce while breeding resentment across Europe. Nationalist sentiment, which Napoleon had helped awaken and exploit, was beginning to turn against French domination, and in the East, Russia's commitment to the French alliance was wavering. The alliance forged at Tilsit in 1807 had never been comfortable for either France or Russia. Tsar Alexander I, initially charmed by Napoleon's personality, had grown increasingly resentful of the continental system, which devastated Russian trade with Britain, Russia's primary market for timber, grain, and naval stores. Russian nobility and merchants chafed under an economic blockade that benefited France while impoverishing Russia. In December 1810, Alexander formally broke with the continental system, opening Russian ports to neutral ships, which in practice meant British ships sailing under false flags. Napoleon could not tolerate this breach. His entire strategy for defeating Britain depended on economic strangulation, and if Russia defied the blockade, other states would follow. Beyond economics, tensions had emerged over Poland. Napoleon's Grand Duchy of Warsaw alarmed Russia by reviving Polish national consciousness and potentially threatening Russian Poland. Alexander demanded guarantees that Poland would never be restored, guarantees Napoleon refused to provide. By 1811, both emperors knew war was inevitable. Napoleon began assembling the largest army Europe had ever seen, over 600,000 men drawn from across his empire and satellite states. Fewer than half were French. Germans, Poles, Italians, Dutch, Spaniards, Portuguese, Croatians, and Swiss all marched under French eagles in this polyglot host. Russia prepared its defense knowing it could not match French numbers, but could exploit its vast distances and harsh climate. In June 1812, the Grande Armée crossed the Niemen River into Russia, beginning the campaign that would destroy Napoleon's empire. From the outset, the campaign defied Napoleon's expectations. Russian armies under Barclay de Tolly and Prince Bagration refused to give battle, instead retreating deeper into Russian territory while implementing a scorched earth policy. Villages were burned, crops destroyed, wells poisoned. The Grande Armée advanced into an emptying landscape where every mile brought new logistical challenges. Napoleon's army, designed for rapid decisive campaigns in Central Europe, found itself stretched across supply lines hundreds of miles long. Horses died by the thousands from overwork and insufficient fodder. Discipline began to break down as soldiers foraged desperately for food. Disease spread through the camps. By By the time the Grande Armée approached Smolensk in August, having advanced 400 miles into Russia, it had lost nearly 150,000 men without fighting a major battle. Smolensk offered the possibility of halting the campaign, establishing a defensive position, and resuming operations the following year. But Napoleon, recognizing that retreat without victory would embolden his enemies across Europe, pressed on toward Moscow. The Russians finally accepted battle at Borodino on September 7, 1812, 70 miles west of Moscow. The new Russian commander, Marshal Kutuzov, had replaced Barclay de Tolly partly due to political pressure to stop retreating and fight. Kutuzov chose a strong defensive position anchored on earthwork redoubts and deployed Russia's full strength, over 120,000 men. Napoleon attacked with 130,000 troops in what became the bloodiest single day of the Napoleonic Wars. The Battle of Borodino was not a tactical masterpiece, but a frontal assault against prepared positions. Napoleon, suffering from a bladder infection and displaying none of his usual aggressive tactical brilliance, ordered repeated assaults against the Russian earthworks. French forces eventually captured the positions at enormous cost. Russian casualties exceeded 40,000, but crucially, Kutuzov withdrew the remnants of his army in good order, rather than allowing it to be destroyed. The Grande Armée had won a battlefield victory, but lost 30,000 men in the process, casualties it could not replace. Moscow lay open, and Napoleon entered the ancient capital on September 14, 1812, expecting that the fall of Moscow would bring Alexander to the negotiating table. Instead, Moscow burned. Whether the fires were deliberately set by Russian authorities or started accidentally by French looting remains disputed, but the result was catastrophic. 3/4 of the city burned over several days, destroying the supplies Napoleon's army desperately needed and eliminating any possibility of wintering in Moscow. For 5 weeks, Napoleon waited in Moscow's ruins, sending peace offers to Alexander that went unanswered. The Tsar, safely in St. Petersburg and under intense pressure from Russian nobility and military to continue resistance, refused all negotiations. By mid-October, with winter approaching and supplies exhausted, Napoleon finally accepted reality and ordered a retreat. The retreat from Moscow destroyed the Grande Armée. Napoleon retraced his advance route, marching through already devastated territory stripped of supplies. Russian Cossacks and light cavalry harassed the retreating columns constantly, cutting off stragglers and supply wagons. Winter came early and viciously cold. Men froze by the thousands. Horses died, immobilizing artillery and supply wagons. Discipline collapsed entirely as survival became every soldier's sole focus. At the Berezina River in November, Russian armies attempted to trap the entire retreat, but Napoleon managed a desperate crossing that saved the core of his army at the cost of tens of thousands more casualties. By the time the remnants of the Grande Armée straggled out of Russia in December, fewer than 40,000 combat-effective troops remained from the 600,000 who had crossed the Niemen 6 months earlier. Napoleon abandoned his army and raced back to Paris, aware that news of the catastrophe would encourage his enemies across Europe. The Russian campaign destroyed not just the Grande Armée, but the myth of Napoleonic invincibility. The emperor who had seemed unstoppable had been defeated not by brilliant generalship, but by space, weather, and Russian determination. News of the Russian disaster electrified Europe. Prussia, humiliated since 1807 and chafing under French occupation and economic exploitation, saw opportunity for liberation. In February 1813, Prussia allied with Russia, and King Frederick William III called his people to a war of liberation. The response exceeded all expectations. German nationalism, that new force Napoleon had helped birth through his reorganization of Germany, now turned against him. Volunteers flocked to the Prussian colors. Austrian Emperor Francis, despite being Napoleon's father-in-law, through Napoleon's marriage to his daughter, Marie-Louise, began quietly rearming. Britain, ever vigilant for opportunities to undermine French power, provided subsidies and diplomatic support. Sweden joined the coalition under Crown Prince Bernadotte, formerly one of Napoleon's marshals, who saw opportunity to gain Norway from Denmark, France's ally. Napoleon demonstrated remarkable resilience. Despite losing an entire army in Russia, he raised new forces with impressive speed. By spring 1813, he had assembled an army of over 200,000 men, and moved to Germany to confront the Prussian-Russian forces. The spring campaign of 1813 demonstrated that Napoleon still possessed his tactical genius, even if his strategic position had become untenable. He defeated the coalition at Lutzen in May and Bautzen in late May, victories that temporarily halted the Allied advance and preserved his control over Germany. But these victories lacked the decisive character of earlier Napoleonic triumphs. Napoleon's new army, though large, consisted largely of young conscripts who lacked the training and experience of the veterans lost in Russia. He particularly suffered from lack of cavalry, as replacing the tens of thousands of horses lost in Russia proved impossible. Without adequate cavalry, Napoleon could not pursue defeated enemies effectively or gather intelligence about enemy movements. The coalition forces learned to avoid decisive battles where Napoleon commanded personally, instead using their numerical superiority to operate against his marshals. In June 1813, an armistice was declared, ostensibly to negotiate peace, but actually to buy time. Austria used the armistice to mediate between France and the coalition while preparing to join the latter. The Congress of Prague in July 1813 demanded that Napoleon accept terms that would reduce France to its 1791 borders and abandon all control over Germany, Italy, and Poland. Napoleon, ever the gambler, rejected terms he considered humiliating and incompatible with French security. In August 1813, Austria declared war, adding over 150,000 fresh troops to the coalition. Napoleon now faced enemies on every side. In Spain, Wellington had invaded southern France. In Germany, 3 coalition armies totaling over 500,000 men converged on French positions. The autumn campaign of 1813 became a slow-motion catastrophe for Napoleon. Coalition forces, advised by former French officers like Bernadotte and adopting the Trachenberg Plan, refused battle when Napoleon appeared personally, but attacked whenever his marshals commanded separately. This strategy leveraged coalition numerical superiority while avoiding Napoleon's tactical brilliance. Napoleon won victories at Dresden in August, demonstrating he could still outfight his enemies when they engaged him directly. But these tactical victories could not compensate for the strategic situation. French forces were slowly being pushed back toward the Rhine by sheer weight of numbers. In October, the coalition armies concentrated near Leipzig for what would be the largest battle in European history before World War I. The Battle of Leipzig, fought October 16th to 19th, 1813, involved over 500,000 combatants. Napoleon faced coalition forces that outnumbered him nearly 2-1. For 3 days, he fought with desperate skill, holding off attacks from all directions, but sheer numbers eventually prevailed. On the third day, with ammunition running low and casualties mounting, Napoleon ordered a retreat. As French forces withdrew through Leipzig, the premature destruction of a critical bridge trapped thousands of French troops on the wrong side, forcing their surrender. The defeat at Leipzig, called the Battle of Nations, destroyed what remained of Napoleon's power in Germany. Within weeks, all French forces had retreated across the Rhine. The Confederation of the Rhine dissolved as German states abandoned Napoleon and joined the coalition. The empire that had stretched from Spain to Poland contracted toward France's borders. The coalition invasion of France in early 1814 found a transformed situation from previous wars. Napoleon faced enemies on every frontier, while his marshals, exhausted by 2 decades of war and increasingly skeptical of ultimate victory, showed diminishing enthusiasm for continued fighting. The French people, ground down by conscription and taxation, no longer rallied to Napoleon's calls with the fervor of earlier years. Napoleon himself rose to the challenge with a final display of his military genius. With barely 60,000 troops, he fought the 1814 campaign in northern France like a tactical symphony, using interior lines and mobility to defeat larger coalition forces piecemeal. He won a string of victories at La Rotière, Champaubert, Montmirail, Château-Thierry, and Montereau. But tactical brilliance could not overcome strategic impossibility. For every coalition army Napoleon defeated, another advanced elsewhere. Paris itself came under threat. In late March 1814, coalition forces approached Paris while Napoleon was absent fighting to the east. The city surrendered on March 31st. Napoleon's marshals, seeing no path to victory, forced his abdication on April 6, 1814. The Senate invited Louis XVIII, brother of the executed Louis XVI, to return from exile and claim the throne. Napoleon was exiled to Elba, a small island off the Italian coast, where he was allowed to retain the title of emperor and a miniature kingdom. The Congress of Vienna convened in September 1814 to reconstruct the European order after 2 decades of war. Diplomats from every European power gathered in elaborate ceremonies, balls, and intrigues while redrawing the continent's borders. They aimed to restore stability through legitimate monarchies and a balance of power that would prevent any single nation from dominating Europe again. The Congress proceeded leisurely, with no sense of urgency and much attention devoted to social events and romantic entanglements. This complacency was shattered in March 1815, when Napoleon escaped from Elba with barely 1,000 men and landed in southern France. What followed demonstrated both Napoleon's charisma and the fragility of the restored Bourbon monarchy. King Louis XVIII sent the French army to arrest Napoleon. Instead, soldiers rallied to their former emperor. When Marshal Ney, who had promised Louis XVIII to bring Napoleon back in an iron cage, encountered his former commander, he joined him instead. Napoleon marched to Paris, gathering forces as he advanced, while Louis XVIII fled to Belgium. Within 3 weeks, Napoleon was back in the Tuileries Palace, ruling France once more. The 100 Days had begun. Napoleon immediately sent peace overtures to the Congress of Vienna, claiming he desired only to live peacefully within France's borders. The coalition powers, shocked by his return and unwilling to accept his word, declared him an outlaw and mobilized their armies. Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia pledged to each field armies of 150,000 men to destroy Napoleon once and for all. Napoleon faced a stark choice: wait for coalition armies to concentrate and be overwhelmed by numbers, or strike quickly while only British and Prussian forces under Wellington and Blücher were immediately available in Belgium. Napoleon chose the offensive, crossing into Belgium in mid-June 1815 with 120,000 men. His strategy was to drive between Wellington's Anglo-Allied army and Blücher's Prussian forces, defeat each in turn before they could unite, then march on Brussels. Initially, the plan worked brilliantly. On June 16th, Napoleon sent Marshal Ney to hold Wellington at Quatre Bras, while he personally defeated Blücher at Ligny, inflicting over 20,000 casualties on the Prussians and forcing them to retreat. But Napoleon's execution lacked the precision of his earlier campaigns. Ney failed to prevent Wellington's forces from withdrawing in good order, and confusion over Napoleon's orders allowed Blücher to retreat northward toward Wellington, rather than eastward away from him. On June 18, 1815, Napoleon confronted Wellington's army deployed on a ridge near the village of Waterloo, south of Brussels. Wellington had chosen his ground expertly, placing his troops on the reverse slope of the ridge, protected from French artillery. Napoleon delayed his attack, waiting for the ground to dry after heavy overnight rain, confident that Blücher's Prussians were too battered and distant to interfere. The delay proved fatal. The Battle of Waterloo began with a French attack on the fortified farmhouse of Hougoumont, intended as a diversion, but which consumed resources and attention throughout the day. French infantry assaulted Wellington's center repeatedly, supported by massive artillery bombardments. The British squares held firm against cavalry charges that became increasingly desperate as the day wore on. Napoleon's brother Jérôme engaged in futile attacks on Hougoumont. Marshal Ney led cavalry charges against unbroken infantry squares, in what would become one of history's most famous examples of cavalry misuse. Meanwhile, Prussian forces under Blücher began arriving on the French right flank from late afternoon, forcing Napoleon to divert the Imperial Guard to hold them off. As evening approached and Prussian pressure mounted, Napoleon committed his final reserve, the elite Imperial Guard infantry, in a climactic assault on Wellington's center. The Guard advanced in perfect order through devastating fire, but British infantry in superior positions broke the attack. For the first time in its history, the Imperial Guard retreated. As the Guard fell back, panic spread through the French army. Wellington ordered a general advance. The French retreat became a rout as Prussian cavalry pursued through the night, turning defeat into catastrophe. Napoleon had lost 25,000 casualties and 8,000 prisoners at Waterloo, while the remnants of his army scattered. He reached Paris 4 days later, but his political position was untenable. The Chamber of Deputies refused to support him. On June 22, 1815, Napoleon abdicated for the second time. He initially hoped to escape to America, but British naval blockades prevented any escape. He surrendered to Captain Maitland of HMS Bellerophon, throwing himself on British mercy. The British government, determined that Napoleon would never again disrupt European peace, exiled him to St. Helena, a remote island in the South Atlantic thousands of miles from Europe. There he would spend his remaining 6 years writing memoirs and constructing the Napoleonic legend while dying slowly of stomach cancer. The 100 Days had ended in decisive defeat. The coalition restored Louis XVIII, and the Congress of Vienna resumed its work, producing a settlement that would maintain general European peace for 40 years. Napoleon's wars were finally over, leaving behind a continent transformed, exhausted, and facing the modern era with the old certainties destroyed and new forces of nationalism, liberalism, and industrialism gathering strength for the conflicts ahead.